Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz musician and project manager for Outside in Music, Simeon Davis. He talked about the release of the new 2022 single Eden that is a part of an album of 8 original compositions drawing on elements of jazz, South African, European folk, neo-soul, and classical. It's called Of Narratives and Nocturnes. It comes out on June 24th, 2022. The Simeon Davis Group is a cross-genre collective playing original music with a focus on storytelling. He's originally from South Africa and now resides in Dallas. He's doing great work in promoting the world of jazz and being a part of it. Enjoy the story.
Hey, thanks for taking a minute out, and again, thanks for sending over the music. I appreciate it.
Of course. I'm really happy to be here. I know it's been cool because we've pitched you a lot of artists from the outside inside, and so it's been exciting to be the person actually on the interviewed side.
Yeah, it is cool, man. Very cool. So your single, Eden, talk to me a little bit about this release. And, you know, what I usually ask artists, and I'm trying to get a gauge of, is, you know, largely for 2 years we haven't had live music. Now we're getting to a point where hopefully things are waking up. You got music coming out. What does this mean kind of overall for you to have this single out?
Gotcha. So I think the first thing with the single is setting the groundwork and setting the stage for our new album, which is coming out. So the full album is called Narratives Nocturnes, and it's releasing on June 24th through Next Level, which is one of the imprints of Outside in Music. The big thing about that is it's something that my band and I have been working on putting together really since 2019. Me as a composer since 2017. And it's a collection of compositions, first and foremost, and those compositions each embody one single programmatic thing. I describe the album as an anthology in the sense of like a book of short stories, perhaps. And the idea being that each of these pieces was not written with the idea of like, okay, we're going to use this form, or hey, we're going to write a post-bop tune, or we're going to write, you know, a classical tune or anything like that. They were written with the idea of, okay, here's a title, here's a concept, here's an experience, here's an emotion. We're writing that. And I really like to think of my band in that context of we're not necessarily just musicians, but really the band is a collection of thespians where we're all actors. It's playing a character, or it's playing an emotion, or it's playing a plot device. So, you know, you'll have the hero, you'll have the villain, you'll have something. I think Eden is a perfect example of that, really, because Eden follows the Judeo-Christian creation narrative, the idea of the fall of man in the fruit and garden, and musically, this piece was written. The form was derived from how the themes interact with each other. So you have 4 distinct themes, which all represent 4 characters. So the opening part of the song Eden, which is that chord progression of the Wurlitzer, that becomes over time both the timbre and the chords themselves to represent the voice of God. Shortly thereafter, we have entering a theme on the male vocals, which both the timbre of the male vocals and, again, the melody, more importantly here, of the male vocal line becomes to represent Adam himself. Shortly thereafter, we have this funky groove enter, God creating Eve, and then she has a melody enter on top of that. And then those 2 melodies, Adam and Eve's melodies, interact and make the idea of them joining together. And then after that, and then possibly the biggest cultural cliche of all time, and I'm really excited about it, we have a slow melody enter, and it's on the electric guitar. And the electric guitar represents the serpent. And I thought that was kind of funny. The serpent is not this suddenly bombastic or brash. It's very patient, very slowly crafted, and it starts maybe just a little bit angular, but not really left of field. And then climaxes in this magnificent guitar solo from Mario Wellman before moving on to the build of a trumpet solo by Jonathan Shire, with the trumpet solo representing and taking elements from both Eve and the serpent, the idea of, you know, almost like a dialogue between them, and tension builds, tension builds, tension builds. And when it finally breaks, we have that Eve's made her decision as Adam's theme enters double its speed and panicked underneath it, realizing what they've done. And the whole piece closes out with a return to the voice of God, and a darker version of those chords with these really dense, swaying, shorter style voicings that represents them being cast out of Eden, as you'll hear the mallets and the toms sort of being like a direct programmatic relationship, the idea of them walking out. I think it's a perfect example for how I write and how the band brings these things to life, and just is really a great sampler for everything else the band is going to be releasing. As far as your relation to live music, we are hoping to use this project, the press we get from it, and the critical reception we're getting from it so far, thanks to people like yourself, and basically use it to bolster our press kit so that we can do a small tour circuit around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That's where we're based right now. So we're hoping to use that and just start making some more headway.
So I guess the other thing that I'm curious about, you said this material was, kind of hatched prior to the pandemic. Did you wait a while to release it? Did you finally get to that point? I'm curious because there's a lot of musicians that talk about the material that was done right before the pandemic, but it's not coming out until now. Is it because the world's kind of waking up and there's a chance to do this live? What was kind of the methodology behind that?
I think it's kind of twofold for us. So on one hand, sort of yes, in a very direct sense. So we actually did record a lot of this music back in 2019. Not all of it. Some of the stuff has been written during the pandemic as well and recorded since then. But we recorded some of it in a live session, actually. We brought an audience into the studio and said we're going to do one take for everything. And as a result, we have some wonderful moments of just energy from the audience in that recording session. But we have a couple moments where it's like, man, maybe this piece was hard and we would have loved a second take for it. And so as a result of that, we kind of just held onto those. Also, the personnel band changed slightly from those recordings. We made those when we were all still in school. Since then, a couple people have graduated and moved back across the world. Our vocalist at the time then moved back to his hometown of Shanghai, and our guitarist moved back to Mexico City. And so we tried to get them for the studio recording session stuff, like just like coming on one song or something, as like a tribute to that. But it's just with the pandemic and stuff, that was insane. So part of it was just the nature of the changed personnel in the band. But the other thing was we were holding off on releasing those live recording sessions because we entered them in a competition that was running, and we made it to like the finals of this competition. Basically, the winner was going to be able to premiere their music and tour in Shanghai, which was going to be super cool for the obvious reason that we would all get a tour to China, and the other reason that it's the hometown of our then vocalist. We were all really excited, and then COVID happened, and obviously there was no tour to China. That sort of was why we held off on the front end, but we and the bassist, who was the recording engineer and mixer and master for the album, we met up and we talked about it like just from the physical recording side, and maybe we can take the opportunity to improve things, this and that. And so he was talking about, hey, if you're willing to hold off on recording and maybe doing a studio style version of this session. He was getting new gear coming in, he was getting more clientele. And so we talked about just holding off just to allow the fidelity of the sound to be upgraded, to allow the clarity of everything that was recorded to be upgraded. So that's actually the main reason we held off on releasing this music until we're doing it now, was we just waiting for the opportunity for a better auditory representation of ourselves just through quality and equipment. And so we were able to record this music in May and June of 2021. We're releasing it now. So I think, yes, pandemic in some ways for sure. But also personnel changing and really just hoping for the best possible product with the equipment that we can get. So,
well, let's talk about your music journey. How did all this begin for you? How did you get involved with music early on? Who were some influences for you?
Oh, for sure. So I feel like mine is a little bit different to the average person living in the Dallas area. So I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa. Long story short, I was born in America, but in 1999, when I was a wee tot, my family moved to South Africa, and I lived there for 17 years. My parents are still there, actually, and I ended up, through a wild series of circumstances, coming to America to study at the University of North Texas in 2016. And that was really the first time I've been to the States for longer than a couple months. So my biggest musical influences, and really the first jazz I ever heard, was not like your normative intro to jazz. It wasn't your Basie, it wasn't your Ellington, it wasn't your Charlie Parker by any stretch of the imagination. My first jazz that I heard and really latched onto was the music of people like Abdullah Ibrahim, who is really, in recent years, started to get even bigger in international acclaim. But he was a pioneer jazz pianist in South Africa, as well as like some of the local legends and teachers at the time. And then other like iconic South African players like Winston Mankunkungozi and Moses Taiwo Mololekwa. And so these musicians and the sort of the timbral elements of that South African jazz style, the like deeply embedded groove elements, and the idea of almost all of these genres have like really, and subgenres have really interesting ostinatos. That I think has definitely been an earworm for me. But back when I was still a high school student in South Africa, there were these weekly jam sessions that were hosted by a local university professor named Dan Shout, a sax player. And they were like the friendliest jam sessions I've ever encountered in my life, the idea being that he just wanted as many people to show up, and it was going to be friendly, and we're going to help the younger guys with putting them with some of like the heaviest cats in the country. And so I was this like little 15-year-old not knowing what jazz was, and every week I would go show up to this jam session, ask Dan, what are the tunes that people were checking out, and try and, me and one of my buddies, we would like go home and try and learn those tunes for the next week. So when I first started going, the jam of the month, all the tunes were Horace Silver, which is great for an entry-level jazz musician. Like, that was really approachable music. I could hear the melodies, but also, and I think part of the way that Horace Silver writes relates to the South African idiom really well, because he also uses these ostinatos. He's very groove-centric, and he has these very singable melodies. So I latched onto Horace Silver really hard when I first started playing jazz. And I think that's still very audible in my music throughout both Eden with the singable melodies, but as you'll hear in the rest of the album when it gets into you very soon, there's so many uses of ostinatos. I remember in 2014 at the National Youth Jazz Festival in South Africa, we had a guest artist who is one of the most famous musicians alive. Her name is Maria Schneider, and I had no idea who she was at the time. And I remember everyone talking about how we got to see a concert, we got to see her concert, we got to see her concert. So the way it works is if you're a student, you basically stand in line. If they had enough free spots, they'll put you inside. So on day one, they did not have enough free spots, so I didn't get to see it, and people walked out of the concert hall crying. And I was like, oh my gosh, what just happened in there? And so the next day, me and some buddies, we spent like 5 hours waiting outside to try and get one of the spots for students. And we did, and I remember watching her music, and my understanding of everything I thought I knew relating to jazz, because I think I was like 17 at the time, so I was pretty confident I knew what jazz was. I was pretty confident I was like a great musician and all this and that. And I saw Maria, and it completely shook my world. And from then on, I think my focus, because she's this amazing programmatic storyteller. Like, everything she writes has this crazy through-composed narrative. Everything she does pushes the music forward. And I didn't have the words to articulate exactly what she was doing or what I was hearing at that time. But I remember being like, I want to do that. Maybe not in the exact same way as her, because I don't have the same musical background, and certainly not the same level of musical prowess as her. She's a genius of the truest true senses. But I was like 17, I was like, that's what I want to do. I don't know what that is, but I want to do that. So even though at the time, and moving forward into the undergrad degree that I got shortly thereafter, I was a sax performance major, the seeds really started being planted for me as a composer. Just a lot of experiments and stuff, and realizing that I liked making music most if it was the worlds that I created. From then on out, I think as a composer, I became influenced by a lot of the people I was just listening to and playing their music of. So like, as far as voicing orchestrations, I was a sax player. I was super into Wayne Shorter, and man, what a great composer too. So his style of bass motions, it was really interesting immediate relationships in his bass motions definitely played a role in how I write bass lines, and his use of the more post-bop style of harmony as well. Also, Joshua Redden, who is underrated as a composer, I think. He's acknowledged as one of the best living sax players, but he's also a master of counterpoint, and I don't think people credit him for that. He has this album called Freedom in the Groove, which has him and Peter Bernstein as the melody instruments, and just the interlocking of the contrapuntal lines are brilliant. And I remember in undergrad, I think I transcribed every single piece on that album and like made charts out of all of them to like and studied it, and that definitely influenced me a lot. I think the other maybe less mainstream influence for me is a 20th century classical composer by the name of Bela Bartok. He did something where he took, I guess, ethnic music, you could call it, from around Eastern Europe, and he would catalog this ethnic music, and he would rearrange it in what was his idiom at the time.
What I would like to know, too, is, as you're in the business of promoting and you're in the business of being a musician. How do those two things work for you, and how do you see your future unfolding in both of those respects?
Well, I think that's a great question. Wow. I think for both of those things, it's definitely been avenues, like the promotion side and the project management side is definitely not something I ever would have initially seen myself getting into, but I'm really grateful for it. It started as an internship with Nick Fenzer at Outstanding Music, and he's taken me on as the project manager doing the promotions, as he talked about since then. I think it's been massively informative because no amount of studies or paperwork would have ever taught me everything I've learned just from doing it for this past few years. And so that's been amazing for me as a musician, because now it's like, hey, if I want to book a gig, well, actually, instead of just trying to, call or send an email, I know how to put together and structure something to present myself in a way that people want to book me. Okay, well, say, I'm trying to get publicity at this place. Well, instead of just saying, here's my bio, here's my resume, here's my new album, I know how it's wanted to be structured and how the industry likes to have everything presented. And I think that's been certainly useful for me as an active musician. It also has opened another avenue just on the income side, which everybody knows is great with the pandemic. But I think something that's been really cool is one of the things I've enjoyed my whole life is writing in the word sense, not necessarily just in the musical sense. And so this has allowed me to really develop as a functional creative writer. And so, because a lot of what I do is I write a lot of the press releases that are sent out that are written for outside of music. And so a lot of those artists have had the opportunity to interact with and get their thoughts on their albums and have that whole avenue open up and just know more artists, as well as, presenting their music in a way that they feel is authentic while also giving me creative freedom to figure out how do I want to present the story of their music, and how will the world receive that. From working at Outside of Music, I actually was very humbled and honored for the opportunity, but the New York promoter, Lydia Liebman, who is like on the Forbes 30 under 30, she's a phenomenal writer and human being. She contacted me and scouted me out and was like, hey, I like your writing. Do you want to write for me? And I was like, of course, that's amazing. So I've got this whole avenue that started opening up with people like big people like Lydia asking me to write, and then getting the opportunity to write for big people in the jazz scene and jazz and creative music scene. And so that's been really cool. That's been really exciting because, like I said, writing words is something I actually really enjoy. As you'll see, and that sort of directly ties into this album. This album is accompanied, some of the programmatic pieces are accompanied by original poetic prose and things like that. And so it really has just provided an opportunity for me to keep writing in a very functional way, but still in a creative way. And I think that's been exciting for me as a budding writer of words or a wordsmith, to help developing that craft in addition to the musical craft, because I think the two can and are very well interrelated and can complement each other very powerfully, whether it's directly in songwriting or whether it's in, two forms of creative expression that can be used in tandem to express the same thing from different angles, which is kind of what's been happening with the album of Narratives Nocturnes.
So let's get to the essence of you. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, coworkers, but ultimately you're the one living your life. You're steering the ship. Who do you think you are?
Wow, that's a hefty question.
Yes.
I think it's definitely multifaceted. I think at the end of the day, I see myself as someone who is trying to learn more, someone who is trying to provide for my family, someone who's a father and a husband. I think those are probably the core of my identity. And then I also just happen to be a musician with, I think my ideas are a little bit left of field sometimes. And so I feel like I don't fit neatly into categories, but first and foremost, I want to create. I want to tell stories. I don't want to create music that I wouldn't want to listen to, and I don't want to play just for the sake of playing. I want to say something that's worth listening to, worth saying, and I, as a creative, I think I value the power of storytelling, the power of naming, and the power of following more than just the tradition to create. I think if I were to, it's a slogan I've started saying, and I don't know, maybe this will become my phrase, as a musician, and I wouldn't even know if I call myself a jazz musician. I'll call myself a jazz adjacent musician. I call myself a composer. I think at the end of the day, that's what it is. I've studied all these different traditions, and I'm not necessarily going to follow one of them individually. I'm going to take what I need out of the toolkit to express. And I think the power of jazz, for me, is not just in what jazz was or what jazz is, but the power of what it has to become. Jazz can become infinitely malleable and blended with anything to make something beautiful, as long as you're willing to take the creative risk to do it. So for me, I think I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I'm a composer. More than any instrument that I play, I'm a composer.
Cool, man. Hey, man, thank you again for reaching out. This has been wonderful. I appreciate it. Good luck with the album and everything that goes forward. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being on it. These have been some
really cool questions to answer, and been quite different to some of the other ones I've been asked. So it's been a really good time for me too.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Dallas, South Africa, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Simeon for his time, music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.